There is a place in the Deep South where you can stand on a quiet dirt road surrounded by kudzu and shattered brick and realize you are standing in the middle of what used to be one of the busiest harbors in North America. No ships, no water in sight, just trees, silence, and a church wall with a cannonball still lodged above its windows. The river that built this place is 2 miles away now. It left, and it took almost everything with it. This is the story of the towns the Mississippi River built, and then quietly erased.
To understand how a town can simply lose its river, you first have to understand what the Mississippi actually is. It is not a fixed line on a map. It is closer to a living, restless thing, a brown vein of water dragging an entire continent's worth of silt south toward the Gulf of Mexico. For thousands of years before any steamboat ever sounded its whistle, native peoples of the lower valley already knew this. The Natchez and neighboring nations used the river's bends and bluffs as crossing points, trade corridors, and seasonal camps, reading its moods the way a sailor reads weather. One such crossing, a narrow inlet south of a larger landing the French called Grand Gulf, became known to early French traders as Petit Gulf, the small Gulf. It sat where a high bluff dropped down to meet a deep, naturally sheltered channel, the kind of geography that, in the age before engines, decided where a town could live or die.
By the early 1700s, European flags had begun changing hands over this stretch of the river with dizzying speed. The French claimed it. Then, after their defeat in the French and Indian War, the British took control. Spain held it for a time after that, handing out land grants to settlers willing to risk fever, flood, and isolation for a foothold on the frontier. Through every flag change, the little settlement at Petit Gulf kept doing the one thing that mattered. It kept growing, because the river kept bringing people to its door.
In 1807, this obscure river landing found itself, briefly, at the center of a national scandal. Former Vice President Aaron Burr, accused of plotting to carve out his own empire in the West, was captured nearby and held under guard at the home of a local landholder while the territorial government decided what to do with him. The magistrate who would later preside over Burr's conspiracy hearing was a respected judge named Thomas Rodney. When the town was formally renamed a few years later, in 1814, it took his name. Petit Gulf became Rodney, and Rodney was about to enter the most extraordinary chapter of its short life.
The steamboat changed everything about the American interior, and nowhere more dramatically than along the Mississippi. Before steam power, moving cotton, sugar, and goods against the current was brutally slow, dependent on poling, rowing, or waiting for favorable wind. Steamboats turned the river into a true highway, one that could carry cargo upstream as easily as down. And Rodney's location, a deep channel running right alongside a stable bluff, made it one of the finest natural ports between New Orleans and St. Louis. By the 1820s, the town had a newspaper. By the 1830s, it had one of the very first opera houses in the entire state, a startling thing to find on what had recently been frontier wilderness. A French naturalist passing through in 1828 sketched the town from across the water, a tidy row of perhaps 20 buildings climbing from the landing toward the bluff, smoke curling from chimneys, flatboats, and the occasional steamer tied up at the bank.
The town's fortunes were tied, quite literally, to cotton. A local physician and planter named Rush Nutt spent years experimenting with cotton hybrids on his nearby plantation and eventually developed a strain so productive and so easy to process that it became known simply as Petit Gulf cotton, named for the town's old identity. Seeds from Rodney's countryside would go on to reshape cotton agriculture across the entire South. Fortunes were made, warehouses filled. The docks at Rodney groaned under the weight of bale after bale, waiting for the next steamboat south to New Orleans. By the 1850s,
Rodney had become, by some accounts, the busiest port on the entire river between New Orleans and St. Louis, a claim almost impossible to imagine today, standing in its empty streets. 2 banks operated there. 35 stores lined Commerce and Magnolia Streets, alongside hotels, saloons, tin shops, dentists, barbers, and bakeries selling pastries to travelers waiting on the next boat. 3 churches served a population that, by 1860, had swollen to roughly 4,000 people, a staggering number for what had been empty riverbank a century before. In 1817, when Mississippi's founding convention met to decide where the new state's capital should sit, Rodney lost that honor by only 3 votes. For one fragile moment in history, the place now buried under vines very nearly became the seat of state government.
But a town built entirely on a river's good behavior is a town built on a promise the river never actually made. The first cracks came not from water, but from disease and war. Yellow fever swept through the lower Mississippi Valley repeatedly in the 1840s, and Rodney was hit hard enough that, at one point, every doctor in town reportedly fell ill at once, leaving the sick with nowhere to turn. Businesses shuttered, families fled to higher, drier ground inland, and some never returned. It was a preview, though no one knew it yet, of how quickly a river town's fortunes could turn.
Then came the Civil War, and with it, one of the strangest and most violent episodes in Rodney's history. In 1863, sailors from a Union gunboat called the USS Rattler came ashore to attend a Sunday church service inside Rodney's Presbyterian church, apparently believing the town to be safely under Union influence. Confederate cavalry, waiting nearby, seized the opportunity and captured the sailors right there in the pews. When word reached the Rattler, the gunboat opened fire on the town, shelling the church itself in retaliation. To this day, a cannonball remains lodged above the church's balcony windows, a permanent scar left by a single chaotic afternoon. The building survived. Much of the rest of the town's confidence did not.
Even after the war ended, Rodney tried to rebuild. Cotton still moved, steamboats still called. But nature was already rehearsing the final blow. Sometime around 1864, a sandbar began quietly forming in the river just off Rodney's Landing, the kind of subtle shift that could easily be mistaken for a temporary nuisance. It was not temporary. Sand built on sand. The current adjusted, and by 1870, the Mississippi River had done what rivers do best. It found an easier path and abandoned the old one entirely. The channel that had run directly past Commerce Street, the very channel that had made Rodney's existence possible, slowly filled with silt and stagnant water. Steamboats simply stopped coming because there was no longer a river deep enough to bring them. A fire in 1869 had already destroyed a significant portion of the town's commercial district, and now there was less and less reason to rebuild. When the railroads finally arrived in the region in the 1880s, surveyors looked at Rodney's steep bluffs and difficult terrain and chose an easier, flatter route through the town of Fayette, 16 miles away instead. It was the final door closing. The river had left. The railroad had refused to come. Rodney had no path left to the outside world at all.
The population that had once numbered in the thousands dwindled to hundreds, then to dozens. The town was formally disincorporated in 1930. Today, by the most recent counts, only a small handful of residents remain, living among buildings that flood whenever the bottomland nearby fills with water, an ironic echo of the river that built and then abandoned the place. The old shipping channel itself still exists, transformed into a quiet lake that traces the river's former path almost exactly.
a watery ghost of the highway that once made this spot one of the most important addresses in the American South. Visitors today have to follow a winding rural road for nearly 2 hours from the nearest city just to find what remains. A handful of leaning houses, an empty Masonic hall, a cemetery on the bluff above town, and the Presbyterian church, with its scarred facade, still standing as the last witness to everything that happened here.
Rodney's story is remarkable, but it was not unique. Up the river, in what is now southeastern Arkansas, an even stranger fate awaited a town with even grander ambitions. In the early 1800s, a merchant named Frederick Notrebe looked at a stretch of land where the Arkansas River poured into the Mississippi and saw the makings of a great American city, something to rival St. Louis or New Orleans. The location was, on paper, extraordinary, a true confluence point where river traffic moving along two major waterways would naturally meet, trade, and resupply. Notrebe's business partner, a retired soldier, purchased acreage at the junction, and the two men began building a town. They gave it a grand and slightly audacious name, choosing to honor the recently fallen French emperor, Napoleon.
For several decades, Napoleon, Arkansas lived up to at least part of that ambition. It grew into a genuine river town, with a marine hospital to treat sailors and travelers, warehouses for goods moving between the two rivers, and a population drawn by the promise of a confluence that nature itself seemed to favor. Travelers passing through described a rough, busy, occasionally lawless settlement, the kind of place where steamboat crews, river traders, and frontier families all crossed paths.
The Civil War turned the area around Napoleon into something else entirely, a battleground for ambush and improvisation. The main channel of the Mississippi, near the town, curved sharply through what was known as Beulah Bend, a turn so abrupt that Confederate guerrillas hiding along the wooded peninsula could fire on a Union vessel as it entered the bend, then simply swing their cannon around and fire on it again as it came back out the other side. It was a brutal natural trap, and Union forces grew desperate to neutralize it.
In the spring of 1863, a Union naval officer named Thomas Selfridge ordered his men to dig a shortcut channel straight across the narrow neck of the peninsula, hoping to bypass the ambush point entirely. The ground was soft, the distance short, and the river's own current did much of the labor. Within a single day, the cut was finished. The very next morning, Selfridge piloted his gunboat through the new passage himself, proving the shortcut worked. It was meant only as a tactical fix, a way to dodge gunfire. No one involved seems to have realized they had just rewritten the river's future.
Rivers, once given an easier path, tend to take it permanently. Over the following years, the Mississippi abandoned its old route through Beulah Bend almost entirely, pouring instead through Selfridge's narrow military shortcut. The old bend slowly became a stagnant oxbow lake, just as Rodney's channel would later become a swamp. But the new channel carved by Union soldiers happened to point in a direction nobody had planned for, directly at the town of Napoleon itself. The destruction that followed was not gradual erosion, it was outright consumption. High water in 1868 caused the town's marine hospital to collapse straight into the river. A far larger flood in 1874 finished the job, submerging whatever remained of Napoleon beneath the current entirely. By that October, the county government, left with no town hall to govern from, packed up and relocated to a nearby settlement called Watson. A town that had been founded with dreams of rivaling St. Louis had been swallowed by the very river that was supposed to make it great, all because of a single day's labor digging dirt to dodge a Confederate gun.
Even now, the town has not entirely vanished from memory or from the landscape. An old iron bell that once called residents of Napoleon to church
now hangs in a Catholic parish in the nearby town of McGehee, one of the only physical objects to have survived the flood. And in unusually dry years, when the level of the Mississippi drops low enough, fragments of brick and foundation occasionally surface on the sandbars near where the town once stood. Fleeting glimpses of a city that mostly exists now only in county records and family diaries.
What makes these stories so haunting is not simply that towns disappeared. Towns disappear all the time, for all sorts of mundane reasons. A factory closes, a highway gets rerouted, a younger generation moves to the city. What happened to places like Rodney and Napoleon was different, almost mythic in its irony. These towns did not fail because they made some fatal business mistake, or because their residents lacked ambition or vision. They failed because the single force that had given them life, the river itself, simply changed its mind. The Mississippi is not a static boundary. It is a living system, constantly eroding one bank while depositing silt on another, constantly straightening its own curves, constantly hunting for the path of least resistance toward the sea. Geologists who study the river's history can point to dozens of towns up and down its length that boomed during the steamboat era specifically because they sat on a deep, stable bend, and then withered just as specifically when that bend silted up, straightened, or shifted miles away.
It is worth pausing here to imagine what daily life actually felt like in towns like these at their peak. Because it is easy, looking at empty fields and crumbling church walls today, to forget how alive these places once were. Picture the docks at Rodney on a humid afternoon in 1855. Dozens of roustabouts loading cotton bales by hand under a brutal sun. The rhythmic chug and hiss of a steamboat's engine idling at the landing. Merchants in tailored coats negotiating prices for the next shipment south. Children weaving between stacked crates. The smell of fresh bread drifting from a bakery on Commerce Street, mixing with river mud and coal smoke.
Picture Napoleon at its busiest. Sailors recovering in the Marine Hospital, while traders haggled over goods arriving simultaneously from the Arkansas interior and the lower Mississippi. 2 rivers worth of commerce funneling through one small, muddy, ambitious town. These were not sleepy backwaters. For a few astonishing decades, they were among the most important commercial points in the entire American interior, places where fortunes were made overnight, and where a town just 3 votes away from becoming a state capital seemed destined for a permanent place in American history. And then, almost without warning by the standards of a human lifetime, the river simply left.
There is something quietly profound in the fact that both of these towns were undone, in the end, by water choosing a slightly different path. Not bombs, not bankruptcy, not even outright disaster in most cases, but a sandbar accumulating grain by grain over a few seasons, or a few hundred yards of soft earth dug out in a single afternoon by soldiers trying to dodge cannon fire. Both decisions, the sandbar's slow accumulation and the soldiers' hurried shovel work, were small. Their consequences were not. An entire town's destiny, it turns out, can hinge on geography so subtle that the people living through it often did not even notice the shift until it was already irreversible.
Today, what remains of these towns serves as a kind of quiet monument to the limits of human permanence, even at the height of American expansion and ambition. Rodney's Presbyterian Church still stands on its hill, scarred but upright, its congregation long gone, but its walls maintained by a small preservation society and the descendants of families who once called the town home. The old channel beside it has become a peaceful lake, fishing line replacing cargo lines, herons standing where steamboat captains once shouted orders to their crews. Napoleon has no standing buildings left at all, only a relocated church bell and the occasional brick fragment exposed during a dry summer. A town whose most lasting physical legacy may be a man-made shortcut dug by soldiers who never intended to build anything at all, let alone end something.
These were not failures of vision. The men who built Rodney and Napoleon read the river correctly for the moment they were living in and built accordingly, with churches, banks, opera houses, hospitals, the full architecture of permanence. What they could not account for was the river's own patience, its willingness to wait decades before quietly rearranging the very geography that had made their ambitions possible in the first place. The Mississippi gave these towns everything they had, then, in its own unhurried and indifferent way, took it all back. What is left now is mostly silence, a handful of structures, and the strange, persistent fact that somewhere beneath the current sandbars and quiet backwater lakes of the Mississippi Valley, the bones of two genuinely significant American towns are still waiting, half buried, for a river that is never coming back.